Many of the ideas that shape today's world emerged hundreds of years ago. And what we see happening in the 16th and 17th centuries is the emergence of a new state structure, something called the modern state. And we're also going to see the evolution of two new types of government: absolutism and constitutionalism. Here are the terms. Make sure you get them all, and we will talk about each of them as we go through the lecture. So, the 16th and 17th centuries saw the emergence of a new state structure, something called the modern state. Some of the characteristics of the modern state were a strong central government, usually a monarchy, that issued laws for the entire country, a professional army paid for by the state. And this is different from what had been in use before, because during the Middle Ages, the soldiers who fought were the knights, and they would come together and fight for their lord when necessary, but they weren't paid for by the state per se. And even after that, it's the citizens who come together and fight. What we're seeing now is what we have today, basically. These are men whose job it is to be a soldier. They train, they fight, they're loyal to the state, and the state pays them. Another characteristic is a trained bureaucracy, and this is responsible for enforcing order, collecting taxes, and so on. And then a vertical social hierarchy, a system where certain groups have more rights. There is the possibility of social mobility, but there are so many barriers that would have to be overcome that it would probably never happen. And so what that means is that you have this social ladder, and you have people at the top because they're born into that position, and they have a lot of rights and privileges. And then you have people born down at the bottom of society, that social ladder, say the peasants. And they don't have the same rights as the people at the top. They will never move beyond where they are. You might have a peasant who is the hardest working, smartest person in, say, France, but it's really not going to get him too far. He's not going to be able to climb that ladder to the top. So, why is all this done? Well, the purpose of the early modern state was better organization of your resources for things like war, empire, and expansion. Two different types emerged. England became a constitutional monarchy, where Parliament checked the power of the king, while France moved towards royal absolutism, where all power is vested in the king. The English solution was most suited to a state that was largely immune from invasion and land war. And if you think about it, England is an island nation, so they are separated from the rest of the continent. Constitutional government required a higher level of political participation of the citizens than did absolute monarchy. Greater participation meant greater freedom of expression, greater toleration of religious minorities, and greater openness in the institutions of government. Well, the alternative to constitutional monarchy was absolute monarchy. So let's look at that for a few moments. I want to look at the origins and then some of the best examples of absolute monarchy if are going to take over and rule. And the son was Louis XIII. And so Louis XIII will continue with the process of consolidating power. And this process will finally culminate, be brought to fruition with Louis XIV. Those who believed that absolute monarchy was the best sort of government, the best type of government, used different methods to justify it. They had all sorts of arguments as to why this is the best form of government. And the most prevalent justification was the idea of divine right kingship. So what is this? It's the idea that kings or queens were chosen by God. They are responsible to God alone. They are placed on the throne by God, and this enabled them to have respect and loyalty. They were above human reproach. In fact, contemporaries said, the king is God's image on earth. So, would you question someone who's only responsible to God? This is not necessarily a new idea. You see this idea at work back in the ancient world with some of the kings and emperors. But now we see it being used to justify why these men and women should have the power that they have. One of the best examples of an absolute monarch emerged in France. As I said, we see France, you see it here on the map, we see France struggling, but in the 17th and 18th centuries, it's going to rise to become a powerhouse. And its king is going to be Louis XIV. So who was Louis XIV? Well, he epitomized the ideal of absolute monarchy. He became the king of France when he was only a little boy, and he ruled for a very long time, from 1643 to 1715. He set the standard, both at home and abroad, for opulence and the style in which he ruled. His objective was personal absolutism. He wanted to supervise everything in France, down to the design of the passports. His motto was, "I am the state," meaning he was France and France was him. He was everything. So what did he do? Well, he centralized state power. First, by weakening the political influence of the traditional aristocracy. You have all these nobles who are very powerful. In the Middle Ages, there were actually nobles who were more powerful than some of the kings. And so you have these nobles who have a lot of land, which gives them power. They have wealth, they have prestige, they have a name. And they were a threat to Louis. So he wanted to find ways to weaken them. And I will get back to that. He also used the Catholic Church and its wealth and property for state interests. He thought that centralized power would give him more tax revenues to wage war. He made Catholicism the official state religion of France, and because of that, he began to persecute the French Protestant minority. Up to 300,000 French Protestants left France. And these are the Huguenots. And if you recall, I mentioned them a few lectures ago. Many of them, about 300,000 of them left France. Many came to the New World, some landing right here in Jacksonville, thus Huguenot Landing and Huguenot Park. Louis, and not the Pope, appointed bishops and other church officials. This gave him ultimate control over how the church behaved. He expanded the French military, which was infused with a nationalist spirit. It was used to keep the peace at home and to fight wars abroad. Well, this costs a lot of money. So he is constantly going to be searching for sources of revenue. He also expanded trade and increased the French influence in the New World. He brought quite a few raw materials into France. His chief legacy was a place, Versailles. Versailles became the center of his government and of his royal court. He always saw his grandeur reflected at Versailles. There's just this order and a uniformity there in the gardens, the buildings, and so forth. It actually started its life as a hunting lodge that his father had built, and Louis XIV comes along and he turns it into this stupendous palace. It became a massive monument to himself and to the splendor of the French monarchy. And Versailles became known as Europe's prized palace, and it helped to shape the tone of royal courts throughout Europe. What I mean by this is that other monarchs throughout Europe, they're seeing Versailles, they're all trying to build their own versions of Versailles. But unfortunately, nobody's going to even come close. Now, a few moments ago, I mentioned that Louis wanted to curtail the power of the traditional aristocracy. Well, one way he set about weakening them was to demand that they come to Versailles. So you're a noble, you want to stay in favor, you want to keep the favor of the king, you want to keep your power, you are summoned to Versailles. Well, think about what might happen if you don't go, if you refuse this order. You go. And so he would bring these nobles there. They're removed from their sources of power. They're under his thumb. Then he gave them jobs. And these jobs were meant to deliberately demean them. So you're this powerful, high-ranking noble. Your job is royal toenail clipper, or royal hem of the robe carrier, or royal wiper of the royal bottom. These were jobs that were designed, like I said, to deliberately demean these people and to keep them under the king's thumb. And it worked pretty well. Versailles is about 16 miles outside of Paris. In Louis XIV's time, this was about a day's journey. Today, not so much. Today, you hop on a bus or in a car and, you're there in less than half an hour. But it was a production to get there back during Louis's time. It took, like I said, about a day. And there was actually a very good reason that Louis built this palace outside of Paris. As a boy growing up inside Paris, in the city, he lived in the Louvre. Today it's a world-famous art museum. During Louis's time, it was a palace. And there was actually an uprising. And he was trapped in there, and there was the fear that he was going to die. And so as he grew up, he just had this fear for his safety, and he believed that he would be much safer outside the city limits. This is the Hall of Mirrors, one of the most famous parts of Versailles. And you see, looking down the corridor, numerous chandeliers. There were more than 1,000 candles in these chandeliers. And this is just an example of the extravagance and the opulence of this palace. In modern day currency, it cost about approximately $2 billion to build. It was so fancy everywhere. Every room was fancy like this. It was so fancy that there were some first-time visitors who came to the palace and were enthralled with what they saw, not realizing that they were actually in the stables, because the stables themselves were opulent and extravagant, with, for example, fireplaces for the 2,000 horses housed there. Here you see Louis XIV's bedchamber. This was really the center of activity during his reign. This is where he'd come to rest, probably exhausted after walking all over Versailles. And this is where at 8:30 every morning he would be woken up by his valet, who would say something to the effect of, "It is time, sir." And thus would begin one of the many ceremonies that occurred every day at Versailles. And in the initial ceremony that occurred every morning, where he woke up, got dressed, etc., or was dressed, there were more than 100 people involved, just to give you an idea. Once he was dressed, he would go out on his balcony and greet his people for the day. Here you see just one small part of the garden at Versailles. Versailles actually sat on 2,000 acres of land, so this place was immense. And the gardens actually rival the beauty of the palace itself. They were laid out, perfectly manicured, many, many fountains, and in fact, the cost of maintaining the fountains and running the water was so high that orders were given that they would only run the fountains when the king himself was walking by. So he'd be strolling through the gardens, and they'd be watching. Okay, here he comes, turn on the fountain. Okay, he's passed, turn it off. So they tried to find ways to conserve. Louis XIV continued working on Versailles throughout his entire reign, and subsequent monarchs like Louis XVI, for example, and even Napoleon will continue with the building process. Unfortunately, Louis XIV bankrupted his country in building this immense palace and all of the grounds, and that is going to help lay the groundwork for the French Revolution, because the kings who come after Louis XIV are going to be struggling to maintain their lifestyle, to run the country, to fight in wars, and just do everything that they do. They're going to be fighting to do this with very little money. Louis XIV exuded royal power, and he was called the Sun King for his brilliant sun-like achievements. So here you see his official emblem, and you'll see this if you see paintings of Louis XIV. You'll see the sun usually in most of these paintings somewhere. He adopted the sun as his emblem for several reasons. One, like I said, his brilliant sun-like achievements, but also because if you think about it, what is the importance of the sun? Well, everything revolves around the sun, just as everything in France revolved around Louis. Here you see a painting of Louis XIV, and you could consider this painting to be propaganda. So just look at it for a moment and think, what is the image that he is portraying? How is he being portrayed in this painting? Well, he's being portrayed as someone with power. You see the idea of divine right. He's being crowned by an angel from above. Why do you think he's wearing a Roman toga? Well, he is trying to identify himself with the Roman emperors, because not since Rome was at the height of its power had any one person held so much power in his hands. The aristocrats understood that the center of advancement lay in the king's court in Versailles. And as I mentioned, he builds it and everybody has to come to him. He is the center of France and everything revolves around him. How does he build all this? How does he maintain his lifestyle? Taxes. Continually introducing new taxes, raising taxes, trying to find resources to bring money in. As soon as it comes in almost, it's going right back out. So, 3 important aspects of Louis XIV's absolute monarchy. Centralization. He is the center of the government. Everything and everybody comes to him. Economic reforms. Trying to build up trade, for example, find sources of revenue, create a stable economy. He was not really able to do this. And then the ideology, the idea of the theater of absolute monarchy. As I said, everything he did was a production. Ceremonies were attached to pretty much every aspect of every moment of his life. Here we see an anonymous letter to Louis XIV. Meanwhile, your people are dying of hunger. The cultivation of the earth is almost abandoned. The towns and countryside are depopulated. All industry languishes and no longer supports the workers. All commerce is destroyed. You have consumed half the wealth and vitality of the nation to make and defend vain conquests abroad. All France is now but a vast hospital, desolate and without provisions. So think for a moment about the problems the author of the letter is citing. Well, the people are starving, they're dying of hunger, Cultivation of the earth almost abandoned, so farming is suffering. Towns and countryside depopulated. Industry is suffering. Commerce destroyed. It says he's consumed half the wealth and vitality of the nation. So he's taking the profits for his own purposes, in this case, wars. And he's blaming Louis. So why Louis? Well, because Louis is the king who is in control of all the finances, the resources, the people. He's making the decisions. Why does he compare France to a hospital? Because it's sick. It's dying. And this last question's, well, pretty obvious and pretty stupid, but why do you think the author of this letter chose to remain anonymous? Ask yourself, would you sign your name to a letter like this going to the king? Probably not. On his deathbed, Louis XIV told his heir, "I have loved war too well. Do not copy me in this, nor in the lavish expenditures I have made." So why do you think he gave this advice? Well, because he recognized what he had done wrong. He saw how he had nearly bankrupted France. And he saw the impact that had, the impact of his poor decisions on his people. And he's hoping that his son, or his heir, will not continue with his policies and will hopefully be able to turn some of these problems around. So, to recap, the French monarchy was based on divine right, nationalist sentiment, proud to be French, power of taxation, and control of the church. In Russia, over in the eastern part of Europe, we see another absolute monarch at work. So here you see Russia in Eastern Europe, the large green country over on the right top, and as you can see, it's huge. Russia is the largest country in Europe, but in the 17th century and the 18th century, it was also the most backwards of all European countries. Peter the Great was another absolute monarch. His goal was to transform every aspect of Russia. He wanted to bring light and modernity to his country. He wanted to westernize his country. He and some of his officials had actually traveled over to Western Europe and realized when he was there how very backwards Russia was. For example, at one point they were staying in the country estate of a nobleman in Great Britain. Had no idea what velvet drapes were. They used them as towels. Didn't use silverware, much like the Europeans in Japan and China. Did not use silverware at a banquet. Used their sleeves to catch their food, to wipe their mouths. The custom at that time in Russia was for the noblemen, most men actually, to have long beards. Well, what Peter recognized when traveling in the West was that was not the style in other Western European countries, and he and his men with their beards filled with old food. It was pretty disgusting. And so he wanted to make changes. So what did he do? Well, he returns home determined to transform his country. He built Russia's first modern army and navy. He was the very first Russian ruler to visit the West and to even try to bring change to Russia. He founded and edited the first newspapers in Russia. So I just talked about some of Peter the Great's accomplishments, and we're going to talk about more, both good and bad, but I want to look at just a few interesting facts about this man, because he's a pretty fascinating person. He was one of the tallest leaders of his time. He towered over everyone else with a height of 6'7". He was a natural athlete, and supposedly he was so strong and skilled with his hands that he could twist a silver platter into a scroll. He used to sleep sitting up, and I already mentioned how he was just a natural craftsman, and he was just always busy making things. Chairs, model boats, crockery, different things, and hundreds of these things were found after his death. He was a macho man, and from just childhood, when he was really, really little, he was obsessed with warfare. He was actually crowned the Tsar when he was 10. And 1 year into his reign, when he was 11, he was given real guns and allowed to form a mock regiment with his friends and servants. And he used to drill with these guys all the time. Unfortunately, a few years later, 24 people were killed during one of his play battles. He loved to joke around. He loved to play practical jokes on people, but he also had a cruel side. He hated his son. His son Alexis was very timid, kind of secretive, and Peter beat him all the time, threatened to kill him. And in the end, Peter demanded that Alexis enter a monastery, but Alexis didn't want to do that, so he ran away to Vienna. And Peter sent men all throughout Europe to search for his son, eventually found him, brought him back to Russia. Alexis swore that he would toe the line, so to speak, and he also swore that he would never attempt to seize power from his father. But nevertheless, in 1718, talk was heard of Alexis boasting about all the things he would do once he was Tsar. Peter heard about this, was so enraged that he rounded up a lot of the potential plotters, anyone he thought was working with Alexis, tortured them in the prison, and eventually brought his own son in, Alexis, tortured him, and had him killed. He was also very strict. He demanded that every teacher at the Naval Academy carry a whip, and that they use that to beat unruly pupils. And during the building of St. Petersburg, his beloved city, it's thought that at least 100,000 serfs and slave laborers died under the poor conditions in which he forced them to work. And so he had absolute power. He could do anything. I mentioned his travels to the West and the laws that were passed regulating your appearance, your actions, beard persecution. He persecuted people who had beards. And he wanted to make his country more Western. He stayed, as I mentioned, at the home of an Englishman, and they stayed for 3 months at the home of this man, Lord John Evelyn. And evidently, after many, many nights of drunken insanity, the gang left the estate, headed back to Russia, and left the house looking like a bomb site. The Russian Empire was later billed for the damage, and this damage included 300 broken windows, 12 broken doors, several broken pieces of walnut furniture, bed linen that had been cut to shreds, a blown-up kitchen floor, and family portraits that had been used for target practice. And so you have to wonder what they were doing there. He believed that education was very important, and so he founded the Russian Academy of Sciences, a scientific institute of learning, a university. He promoted trade with China and Japan, as well as with Western Europe. And so when you were going through the lecture on China, I mentioned how trade negotiations were held with Russia, and eventually trade was opened between the two countries. That's during this time with Peter the Great. He also was the first Russian ruler to explore Siberia. He learned over a dozen trades and crafts. One of his goals was to create a service society. He wanted to create a society where everybody served the state in some capacity, but where social status and social mobility depended on merit, talent, and achievement. For example, the commander-in-chief of the army was a former pastry chef, but he was the most suited to the job. And I mentioned that Peter himself learned more than a dozen trades and crafts. One thing he was very interested in was woodworking. And after his death, it was discovered that he had made hundreds of pieces of furniture, and they were scattered throughout his various residences. He was also fascinated with dentistry. He studied it. He practiced it. He carried a leather pouch on his belt, and his officials learned very quickly not to complain of a toothache in his presence, because he was known to stop a meeting, sit the person down, pull out their tooth, drop it in his bag, continue on with the meeting. And again, after his death, a lot of bags of teeth were found scattered throughout his various residences. He also welcomed Protestants and other religious minorities. Why would he do this? Well, they were skilled workers. He recognized that he wants to build his country up, so these people could bring their skills with them and use them for their new homeland, Russia. So he invited them to come and settle in Russia. So, for example, when a lot of the French Huguenots are leaving France, many come to the United States, but many of them also go to Russia. He was fascinated by Western technology and introduced products like wine and potatoes. He wanted to enforce a more gentlemanly manner on the nobles. So under his rule, laws were passed which said things like the noblemen, for example, had to shave their beards and wear wigs. And this is because it was not the style, as I said, in Western Europe to have long, scraggly beards. So you had to do this. Otherwise, you would have to pay a huge fine, or you could even be thrown in prison. They actually had men who were known as the beard police, who would go from door to door checking to make sure that you shaved correctly. There were laws passed that said you were not allowed to spit. You were not allowed to pick your nose. These things were not gentlemanly, and you had to be a gentleman at all times. Well, there were a lot of similarities between Louis XIV and Peter the Great. Peter tried to use the Russian Orthodox Church to finance his projects, just as Louis had used the wealth of the Catholic Church for his own and state interests. Just as Louis built Versailles, Peter was also a great builder. His chief legacy was an entire city, the city of St. Petersburg. It sits on the Gulf of Finland and the Baltic Sea, and it was called the Window to the West because it's looking to Western Europe. And in fact, he moved Russia's capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg. It gave quicker access to the west through the sea rather than over land. So here you see St. Petersburg today. And over the years from the time of its founding, it is going to become a major trading port in Russia. So who's paying for all of this? Well, the peasants. The peasants are paying the bills. They're the ones who pay the taxes. They're the ones who fought in the wars. And we see the same situation in France. We see the upper class is exempt from taxes and a lot of responsibility, while the lower classes are stuck with them. As a result, both France and Russia will experience violent revolution. France in 1789 with the French Revolution, and Russia in 1917 with the Russian Revolution. So what we see then with this idea of absolute monarchy is that not since Rome's emperors were at the height of their glory had power been more concentrated in the hands of rulers, and they continued to consolidate their power over the centuries. But these monarchs discover that even though they've consolidated power, they have to protect themselves and their power from competing dynasties and rebellious subjects. And more than anything else, the consolidation of the state was propelled by war, which required increased governmental powers of taxation. It's estimated that perhaps half of all revenue of the Western states went to finance war. To maintain its military forces, the state had to squeeze every penny from its subjects. Old taxes had to be collected more efficiently. New taxes had to be introduced and enforced. The goal was to extend the authority of the monarch over his state and to centralize his control over the machinery of the government. And we see this happening throughout the 17th and into the 18th centuries. The result is the belief of many that the king's authority came from God, but as people will recognize, his power came from the people. The richer and more powerful the king, the more potent was his state. His subjects began to identify themselves as citizens of a nation and to see themselves in distinction to other nations. So that's what's happening with the majority of nations in Western Europe, but not all. What's happening with England? In England, there's going to be a clash between the Crown and Parliament, and the most profound challenge to the authority of monarchs is going to take place in England. What happens is that Queen Elizabeth I dies. Well, she never married. She has no male heir. And so the crown is going to pass to her next nearest living blood relative. Well, that would have been her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, the Queen of Scotland, except that Elizabeth had beheaded her. However, Mary had a son. That son was James I, at the time the King of Scotland. And he is going to be offered the crown, the throne of England. He will accept. He will come to England and begin the Stuart, S-T-U-A-R-T, dynasty. And he believed in royal absolutism. He was not beloved by all his people. He was obnoxious. He said, "As it is atheism and blasphemy to dispute what God can do, so it is presumption and high contempt in a subject to dispute what a king can do." So in other words, you wouldn't question God, so you don't question me. James I annoyed pretty much everybody while he was on the throne. He annoyed the nobility because he constantly needed money, had a hard time getting it, and so he would force the nobles to give him loans. And, well, they didn't really like this that much. And they discovered it's really hard to say no to the king. At the same time, he did try to win over the nobility by giving many of them new offices and titles. He annoyed the Puritans. The Puritans demanded that the Anglican Church, the Church of England, be further reformed. They felt there was still too much Catholicism left. And so they would make their demands to James, and he would just refuse. He also, I should mention, was a Catholic, ruling a Protestant country. He also annoyed Parliament. He, for example, conducted foreign policy without consulting Parliament. He centralized and consolidated the power of the government. Many members of Parliament were Puritans, and he would go to Parliament and say, "Hey, we're going to war against against France, and I need X amount of money." And so these members of Parliament would say, well, first, before we consider doing that, we want you to make these changes in the church, for example. And he would refuse. And so he was constantly butting heads with Parliament. And then he annoyed the merchants because, much like the nobility, he would force them to give him loans. So he was not well beloved by many of his subjects. And then, in 1625, he died. And his son, Charles I, inherits the throne and will continue with his father's policies. Charles I was even more obnoxious, to his subjects anyway, than his father. He was married to a French Catholic princess. He's ruling a Protestant country, but he outwardly favored the Catholic elements in the church, which means when the Puritans would come to him wanting change, he said, nope, sorry. He constantly needed money. This is a major theme of his reign, and he would, like his father, force his subjects to give him loans. So he was not popular. He tried to collect taxes without Parliament's consent. Parliament refused to agree to his request to raise taxes. Finally, in 1628, Parliament got so fed up with the king that it created a document called the Petition of Right. This is a constitution of sorts. And basically what it does is it lays out the limitations on the power of the king. For example, it says that all taxes not approved by Parliament are illegal. So the king can no longer go around Parliament and force his subjects to give him money. No quartering of soldiers in private homes. As a cost-saving measure, the king had been forcing his subjects to house and feed soldiers. And no arbitrary imprisonment in peacetime. That means if the king wants someone to give him money and they say no, he can't throw them in prison without them being charged and sent to trial. The king was not happy with this, but he was forced to sign it. And one interesting thing about the Petition of Right, Parliament is composed of two parts, or two houses. There's the House of Lords, which is hereditary, so you inherit your position in the House of Lords. And then there's the House of Commons, which is elected. And this is like the middle class, who are elected representatives of the people. And traditionally, members of the House of Lords tended to be more on the side of the kings than the House of Commons, especially with these Stuart kings. But here, both houses unite to create and sign this document and then force the king to sign it as well. And so he does in June of 1628. And this document remains part of the English government even today. Even though Charles signed the Petition of Right, that didn't mean that he wanted to abide by it. And in the next year, 1629, he gets so fed up with the restrictions that Parliament is placing upon him that he just shuts them down. He suspends Parliament and sends them home. And for the next 11 years, he will rule without Parliament. It doesn't go real great for him. And his goals were to rid the nation of Puritans, to root out any opposition. But what happens is that during that 11 years that he's ruling on his own, he ends up annoying so many people that the Puritans and the opposition, all these other groups who were opposed to the king, grew closer together. Charles continued to oppose church reform, and it's going to lead to trouble for him. We get to 1640, and Charles has tried to change the church services in Scotland. The people aren't happy, and so the Scots raise an army and invade England. Charles is panicking. He needs money to raise his own army. Well, he can't get it, and he realizes he has to call Parliament back into session. So he does. And he says, hey, I need money to raise an army. And they're like, well, first, you have to accept these religious and political reforms that we've been trying to get you to pass for years. Charles is not happy. Charles tries to arrest 5 leaders of Parliament, these 5 men that he felt were his opposition standing in his way. He fails. So we come to the English Civil War. This is a major struggle between the king and Parliament. Parliament wanted to curtail the king's desire to raise taxes. They also wanted to curtail his authority in imposing his own religious beliefs on the country. And it doesn't work. Both sides end up raising armies and going to war against one another. The king's side is called the Cavaliers, and his army is composed mainly of aristocrats, large landowners, people who are loyal Anglicans, loyal to the king. Then we have Parliament's side. They were called the Roundheads because of the way they wore their hair. Because the aristocracy, you could tell they were the aristocracy because they had long curly hair. Whereas the members of Parliament, many of them middle-class business people, they cut their hair short. So they're called the Roundheads. And like I just said, they're composed mainly of business people, smaller landowners, tradesmen, artisans. Finally, 1647, the English Civil War comes to an end. Charles I is arrested and tried for treason. He's considered to be a traitor because he raised an army and fought against his own people. A trial is held, and he is found guilty of treason. Here you see the death warrant of Charles I. As I said, a trial was held, and there were 59 commissioners or judges, as well as 30-something other officials who sat in on the proceedings and made the decision. And here you see the wax seals of these commissioners charging Charles I with treason and sentencing him to death. Charles I was executed on January 30th of 1649. And it was a really cold day, and he had to walk a distance from the palace to the scaffolding where he was going to be executed. And so he wore several layers of clothes, including 2 heavy shirts, because he didn't want to shiver in the cold and have his people think that he was afraid, because there were a lot of people gathered to watch this execution. And so I want to read something to you. This is from an anonymous source, someone who was present at the execution. And he writes that the king climbed up onto the scaffold and then turned and addressed the crowd. And he said, quote, "As for the people, truly I desire their liberty and freedom as much as anybody whomsoever. But I must tell you that their liberty and freedom consist in having of government those laws by which their life and their goods may be most their own. It is not for having share in government, sirs. That is nothing pertaining to them. A subject and a sovereign are clear different things. And therefore, until they do that, I mean that you do put the people in that liberty, as I say. Certainly they will never enjoy themselves. Sirs, it was for this that now I am come here. If I would have given way to an arbitrary way, for to have all laws changed according to the power of the sword, I needed not to have come here. And therefore I tell you, and I pray God it be not laid to your charge, that I am the martyr of the people." And he turned to the executioner and said, "I shall say but very short prayers, and when I thrust out my hands." So what he's saying is that when he puts his hands out in a certain way, that's the sign to do it. Then, back to the reading, then he called to the bishop for his cap, and having put it on, asked the executioner, "Does my hair trouble you?" who desired him to put it all under his cap, which, as he was doing, by the help of the bishop and the executioner, he turned to the bishop and said, "I have a good cause, and a gracious God on my side." The bishop said, "There is but one stage more, which, though turbulent and troublesome, yet is a very short one. You may consider it will soon carry you a very great way. It will carry you from earth to heaven, and there you shall find to your great joy the prize you hasten to, a crown of glory." The king adjoined, "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be, no disturbance in the world." The bishop said, "You are exchanged from a temporal to an eternal crown, a good exchange." Then the king asked the executioner, "Is my hair well?" And taking off his cloak and George, which was the jeweled pendant signifying he was king, he delivered his George to the bishop. Then, putting off his doublet, and being in his waistcoat, he put on his cloak again, and looking upon the block, said to the executioner, "You must set it fast." The executioner said, "It is fast, sir." The king said it might have been a little higher, and what he was talking about was the block where he was to put his neck. He meant that it could have been higher so he wouldn't have to kneel down so far. And so the executioner says, "It can be no higher, sir." The king said, "When I put out my hands this way, then." Then, having said a few words to himself as he stood, with hands and eyes lifted up, immediately stooping down, he laid his neck upon the block, and the executioner, again putting his hair under his cap, his Majesty, thinking he had been going to strike, bade him, "Stay for the sign." The executioner said, "Yes, I will, and it please your Majesty." After a very short pause, his Majesty stretching forth his hands, the executioner at one blow severed his head from his body, which, being taken up and showed to the people, was with his body put into a coffin covered with black velvet, and carried into his lodging. His blood was taken up by divers persons for different ends, by some as trophies of their villainy, by others as relics of a martyr, and in some hath had the same effect, by blessing of God, which was often found in his sacred touch when living. So, what he's saying is that Charles I considered himself to be a martyr of the people. He did not feel that he had done anything wrong. And his execution, as you can see by this painting, gathered a huge crowd, because it's not every day that people kill their king. And once the deed was done and he had been beheaded, a lot of people rushed up to the scaffolding. The reading stated that some people dipped their handkerchiefs in the blood. This is because they truly believed that a divine person had just been killed, and they wanted a memento of that. But the bottom line is that Charles is dead. England no longer has a king. With their king dead, the monarchy is abolished. And Oliver Cromwell, who had been one of the leaders of Parliament, and the Puritans will rule for the next 11 years. They will form the Puritan Republic. If you recall from when I talked about the Puritans with the Reformation, they lived under very strict guidelines. Their religion was tied to their government, and it was very intrusive into the lives of the people. So now we have England being ruled by the Puritans, and life was really hard. As the Puritans said, all forms of, quote, merrymaking and amusement were outlawed. That meant that the theaters are closed, music is not allowed, dancing is not allowed, holidays are abolished, no restaurants, no fun basically. And so for 11 years, this is how the people of England are living. And they finally realize they want their king back. Charles I was gone, But he had a son, several actually, but his oldest son was Charles II, and he had gone into exile during the English Civil War. Now he is invited to come back to England and to restore the monarchy. And so in 1660 he does this, and this period during which he reigns, which will be the next 25 years, is known as the Restoration, because he not only restores the monarchy, but he restores England to where it was before the Puritan Republic. And just as an aside, there's a very good movie about this. It's called Restoration, and it stars, believe it or not, Robert Downey Jr. as Charles II. And he does a pretty good job with it, and the movie is pretty factual and pretty entertaining. During the Restoration, the monarchy is restored. The changes brought by the Puritans are reversed. So the theaters are reopened, holidays are restored, and so forth. Charles was smart. He didn't come in like his father and grandfather and start fighting Parliament, because one of the big themes of the reigns of James I and Charles I was that they were always clashing with Parliament. Charles II steers a middle path, and he gets along well with Parliament. He's known as the Merry Monarch, because while he's on the throne, it's basically party city. Like I said, everything's reopened, the people are celebrating, they're happy. Here, if you're interested, is the Stuart family tree, showing down towards the bottom the Stuart kings, James, Charles, and then Charles's two sons. Charles II also actually worked to strengthen the Church of England. So, his father and grandfather resisted this, but Charles II agreed. Laws were passed which said that only Anglicans, that's the Church of England, could attend universities, serve in Parliament, or be priests in the Anglican Church. And so we see the Church itself being strengthened. And Charles II, on the whole, was a very popular monarch. But then he died. James II was Charles II's younger brother. And when Charles died, James took the throne and became James II, King of England. And he evidently learned nothing from his father's execution, because he comes to the throne, tries to rule as an absolute monarch, and asserts divine right. The people were not happy. Add to that the fact that he was a Catholic. And so even though he's ruling a Protestant country, even though laws had been passed to strengthen the Anglican Church, he still is pushing his own faith. And several things happen that really make his subjects angry, upset, and then worried. First, he begins to appoint Catholics to high government offices. This is against the law of England. And he antagonized even his firmest supporters by doing this, because he's openly violating the laws of the country. When there was protest, he dissolved his first parliament and never called another. Then there were three things that happened that really made the English Protestants nervous. First, in 1687, he announced that all government posts would be open to Catholics as well as Protestants, again, openly violating the laws of his country. Second, James stationed 13,000 soldiers just outside London. A lot of Londoners were terrified that he was preparing to force England to accept Catholicism as the state religion. And then third, and most disturbing, his wife had a baby boy. And I know that sounds really terrifying. In this case, it was to the English people, because James is a Catholic, his wife is a Catholic, and this new baby boy is a Catholic. And so English Protestants were terrified at the prospect of a long line of Catholic kings. But This baby was not James's only heir. He had been married before, and his first wife had been a Protestant and had raised their daughter, Mary, as a Protestant. Mary is now an adult, and she's the wife of a very powerful Protestant prince in the Netherlands, William of Orange. Members of Parliament come up with a secret plan. They send a secret message to William and Mary, and they ask them to come to England and overthrow James for the sake of Protestantism. They agree. And in November of 1688, William sails to England with his army. He lands and begins marching towards London. Well, he's encountering various units of the English army, and soldiers, including the commander of the English army, actually desert their posts to join William. And this is because they don't like what's going on either. So William is marching towards London with a growing army. James hears about this, is terrified, and packs up his wife and baby, heads to France, where he will at one point try to gain French support to come back and regain power. Not going to be successful, and so he'll end up living the rest of his life in exile in France. William and Mary, meanwhile, are going to end up taking control of England and becoming joint monarchs. This incident is what is known as the Glorious Revolution, or the Bloodless Revolution, so called because there's no actual fighting. There is a peaceful transfer of power. So, as I said, William and Mary become the new monarchs. But first, Parliament wants to make sure that all of the problems England's been experiencing for decades, the struggles with the Stuart kings, the English Civil War, the problem with James II, they don't want that to happen again. So, they create a document called the English Bill of Rights. And this is a document which lays out the rights of the citizens and then puts limitations on the power of the monarch. William and Mary read it, they agree to it, they sign it. They agree to abide by it. And so their signatures on this document create a new form of government, a constitutional monarchy. And this is a type of monarchy where you have a king or queen, but they rule jointly with Parliament. So they do not have absolute and total power. Their power is checked by the power of Parliament. The English Bill of Rights just reaffirmed traditional English freedoms. For example, all citizens had the right to a trial by jury. Habeas corpus, the guarantee that you can't be imprisoned without being charged. The right to petition the king or the crown to fix grievances, to fix problems. And it lays out all these various rights that the citizens have. And then, probably most important, it also affirmed that the monarchy is subject to the laws of the land. So the monarchy is not above the law. That's how the Stuart kings were trying to rule, as if they were above the law, as if it didn't apply to them. The English Bill of Rights says yes, the law applies to you, the monarch, just as much as it applies to every English citizen. So the results of the Glorious Revolution were that the power of the monarchy was limited, and that it occurred without bloodshed. Parliament ended any attempt at absolute monarchy in England, and a new form of government was created, a constitutional monarchy. And this is a system of government that was unique for its time. And a century later, it's going to spawn dozens of imitators. This is the type of government in the next century that everybody's going to want. So we have these two types of government: absolute monarchy, constitutional monarchy. Thomas Hobbes was an Englishman, and he supported the idea of absolute monarchy. He lived during the English Civil War, and he believed that the best form of government, the only reasonable form of government was an absolute monarch. He had witnessed the turmoil of the English Civil War, and that just reinforced his belief that absolutism was the most logical form of government. He wrote a book called Leviathan, which was his response to the English Civil War, and he wrote this 2 years after the execution of Charles I. Here is the original cover of the book, and you see the king larger than life, reigning above everybody, and I don't know if you noticed, but his body, his clothing, his body is made up of his subjects. So he is everything to them. And this book argued that the only absolute power was the power of a king, who could provide an environment that was secure and orderly enough for people to pursue their individual interests without hurting society as a whole. Hobbes was influenced by natural laws. He took a secular approach. His theories were derived from his take on human nature. He felt people were innately selfish, wicked, and competitive. He felt people just could not cooperate with one another, and so human relations would always be characterized by strife. He felt that passion, not reason, ruled human behavior. Only a strong ruling authority could end this strife, he said. If he or she did not hold supreme power, society would collapse. Here are some of the ideas from Leviathan. Hobbes argued for tyrannical rule on the basis of his conception of the human being in the state of nature. Natural man is as a wolf to other men. In the state of nature there is war of all against all. So again, he believed that human interactions are characterized by strife, chaos, and war at all times. Men surrender liberty to a sovereign ruler in exchange for peace and security. Having traded their liberty away, they have no right to take it back. The ruler may do anything to his subjects short of killing them, which would defeat his purpose. So what he's saying here is that common man, ordinary people, cannot bring peace to society. That's up to the ruler. So people exchange their independence. They give that freedom over to the ruler, the absolute monarch. He, in turn, will ensure that there is stability and order and peace in society. John Locke was another Englishman. He was a statesman and a thinker. In 1690, he wrote a book called Two Treatises on Government. And one thing that inspired him was the declaration of the English Bill of Rights the year before. They just kind of validated his ideas. So he writes this book, and in this book he takes direct issue with Hobbes's views. Whereas Hobbes says, oh, people are just evil. They can't control themselves. Locke argued that people were essentially good. People are capable of great things, Locke said. Locke's concept of the state was a parliamentary government where power is checked. Hobbes felt that the whole purpose of the government is to protect and defend individuals of their natural-born rights. If the government fails to uphold the people's natural rights, the people have the right and the duty to dissolve that government. That is what Locke believed. And his ideas were central to modern politics. In fact, Locke is considered to be a founder of the liberal tradition, which seeks to protect individual liberty. So you could ask, did the English people have a right to rebel against Charles I in 1642 and against James II in 1688? Could a ruler lawfully be overthrown by his subjects? Thomas Hobbes would say no. There is no such thing as a right to rebel. John Locke would say yes. People oppressed by their government have every right to rebel. Since the chief purpose of government was to stop society from falling into disorder, Hobbes reasoned that an absolute monarchy, having complete power, was best. John Locke held a different, more positive view of human nature. He believed that people have the gift of reason, and as reasonable beings, they have the natural ability to govern their own affairs and to look after the welfare of society. John Locke said that the state of nature is marked by absolute freedom and equality. The law of nature is the only law in the state of nature. This law is the power of the human being to exercise reason. Reason is the foundation of natural rights for men. So says John Locke. In Locke's opinion, governments were formed to provide three basic human rights: the right to life, the right to liberty, the right to property. So what was the government? It was a contract in which the rulers promised to safeguard people's natural rights. If any government abused these rights, people were justified in rebelling. Well, his two treatises on government, written only 2 years after the Glorious Revolution, served to justify the overthrow of James II. And Locke's theories are going to have a huge importance for future revolutionaries, because less than 100 years later, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, a young lawyer named Thomas Jefferson is going to use Locke's ideas to justify the rebellion of 13 American colonies against their English king. So what happens is, as we've seen, the efforts of European monarchies to centralize their power came at the expense of the church, the aristocracy, and the people to some extent. It was a difficult struggle that took place over decades. The lesson that the English ruling elites learned was that for a nation to enjoy the benefits of a powerful central authority, it was necessary to restrain that authority. And there the Glorious Revolution helped to create a constitutional balance between the ruler and the ruled. Elsewhere, we see absolute monarchs forging nations for a new age. Rulers such as Louis XIV and Peter the Great had a style of rule which showed the royal state at its height, still revolving around the king, but more and more dependent on permanent institutions of government that followed what they felt to be important. The absolute state harnessed the economic and intellectual resources of the nation to the political will of the monarch, who ruled by incorporating vital elements of the state into the process of government. The English and French forms of government are going to end up becoming models for other nations, and we will see in the next few weeks where all of that will lead.